What's up, everybody? Welcome to the CanesInSight Baseball Podcast, powered by Anajar and Levine Accident Attorneys. We are here with Mr. Perfect, the star of the Bullpen Mafia podcast, Javi Salas. Throw him a follow and a subscription on the Bullpen Mafia podcast for baseball talk in general. Great stories, just great stuff with them. Had great guests. I think you had Dontrell Willis right the other day, so you guys are really cooking with that content. Bringing it back home here with Canes baseball. Some good news finally. We had some negative draft podcasts, now a positive draft podcast. We're going to talk about two returning players. One returning player and one incoming player that you weren't sure you were going to get that will be making a big impact on next year's team. That is Brian Walters, Adrian Areizaga. Major positions of need, major talents who have foregone the ability to go to the major leagues to play for the Hurricanes. So we'll talk about that. First, a word with some of the best friends that Canes baseball has.
This episode of the CanesInSight podcast is brought to you by our friends at Sala Astorita & Cox, a boutique law firm focusing on securities regulatory matters, broker-dealer and investment advisor regulation, white-collar criminal defense, complex commercial litigation, and securities arbitration and litigation. The firm aggressively represents clients throughout the nation. Contact them now at 561-989-9080 or visit them online at salalaw.com.
All right, Hav, good news for a change. We had a really, really rough draft season. A lot of big names going, a lot of guys from the from the high school class, a lot of important upperclassmen. But good news finally on the way. Brian Walters, probably the best pure stuff on this Miami roster, comes back. He was drafted by the Seattle Mariners, 19th round. Likes to forego that pick. Come on back. Adrian Areizaga, we have not seen yet, but we heard about. Shortstop out of Puerto Rico, 14th round pick. Comes to the U, and really major decisions in Miami's favor here.
Yeah, look, you're exactly right. In terms of where we were, what we talked about 3 weeks ago to where we are now, certainly a lot more comfortable having both of those guys, penciled into our opening day roster, spring 2025. I know the Walters decision was one of the things that kind of went down to the wire. We weren't really sure. We didn't really hear from either side where that decision was headed. With the Areizaga news, you hear more and more about this draft being truncated to 20 rounds. If you do get drafted, that means the team really wants you, right? Like there's not many situations where teams are sort of taking flyers on guys. When they draft a player, it's because they want them in their organization. We saw the Reds and Areizaga kind of go down to the wire here. It's a really nice get for this Hurricane Ball Club. You're getting a shortstop, the number one player out of Puerto Rico, a big-time position on the infield. I mean, we talk about what the guts of the field, right? We talk about catcher, shortstop, center field. The last 3 weeks, the Hurricanes have locked up presumably two shortstops that are going to be part of their future the next couple of years in Degodi, Areizaga. Obviously, if you got to imagine the coaches in that office, in that locker room, they're really excited to get both Degodi, get Areizaga, get Walters to shore up that rotation. So nice couple of weeks for the Hurricanes.
Yeah, look, learning more about this player who I had not seen. I'd heard about him just from people on the board saying that they heard from a guy. He's kind of like a legend. They're like, yeah, we heard from a guy. We got a Puerto Rican shortstop that's really good. Our buddy Harold Martinez had a lot of good things to say about him. But then kind of digging in, watching these highlights we have here, it seems more toolsy, I guess, than I knew about. You got two Belen Jesuit middle infielders, heady guys, of course, coming from Belen, glue guys, to use the Bullpen Mafia term. But nice to get some tools in here with somebody with the projectable size, 6'2", 185, power over hit, 6.53 in the 60, which maybe you could put that time in context with some of these other tools. But you like the fact that you're kind of swinging high with a player like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to speak to his draft positioning, right? He's a 14th round pick. I just talked about the truncated draft, a guy who major league teams had their eye on, right? He was number one player out of Puerto Rico. Talk about that speed. You talk about the tools. This is a high ceiling player. Again, we don't want to put a ton of expectations on these freshmen coming in, especially at the shortstop position. We know how important that is to a baseball team. But again, you add a player like Areizaga, definitely one of those high ceiling guys. You hope that you get him into the development pool. we don't necessarily know what that shortstop position is going to look like. Again, such an important position, but you bring in two really solid players, two really good options that are going to battle it out in the fall, and Dugodi, Areizaga. You bring in a guy like Ogden from the transfer portal. So you've added a lot of depth to the infield. You've added experience. You've added two very good high ceiling freshmen that are going to be able to compete for that position right away. And look, I think the sky's the limit for this for Areizaga. You mentioned some of the tools. You mentioned the speed, the size. There's definitely, he can put some more meat on those bones. I think he's going to get into the weight training program and excel there. I'm excited to see what the next 2 to 3 years look like up the middle for the Hurricanes.
Now, last year, of course, with Tony Jimenez, highly touted recruit, did not perform in his first year. We'll see what happens at UCF. We're hoping for the best for him. I mean, we've seen guys blow up at that second stop, obviously, in this transfer portal era. But that showed you the freshman, no matter how highly touted, not a guarantee, particularly at that position. We need a backup second baseman just as much as we need. We don't have a shortstop either until we got these two guys. We still need that backup second baseman if a guy like Dorian goes down. So is it too much on these guys' plates to say, hey, you're going to battle out for the starting shortstop, and by the way, we're going to need one of you to back up Dorian if something gets hurt, happens to him, he gets hurt?
Well, look, I think that just goes to speak to versatility, right? I think when you are a shortstop, you're presumably one of the better defenders on the diamond, right? I think the shortstop position in baseball traditionally has always been someone that's sort of the anchor of your defense, shortstop, center field. You want to be really solid up the middle. I keep harping on that because it is so important. Catcher, shortstop, center field. We've seen the Canes identify the best defensive catcher in the transfer portal class, went out and got him. Shortstop, they addressed two freshmen that, again, we talked about him in his last year. You don't want to make necessarily put a ton on these guys' plates, but the opportunity is there. The shortstop position is unfilled. So one of these guys is presumably going to play shortstop opening day. But I like to think of it, the shortstop will have the ability to move around. You're such a good defender that you can play second base, you can play third. We saw JD Urso play some first base. I don't anticipate that happening again. We've obviously added some big time, bats and guys that we can play at first base. I think that position is covered, but usually for shortstop, you can move around the infield. I think we're confident enough saying that we've seen enough out of a guy like Brandon Dugodi, who's played at Belen Jesuit. He's played high-level high school baseball. I'm very confident in the fact that, big league bloodlines in the family. He can move around the infield if needed. We know Dorian's going to play a solid second base. We have Daniel Cuvée slotted in at third base. It's a great opportunity for freshmen to show their versatility. And I think the more versatile you are in today's day and age in baseball, the more value you have to a club. So if I were coming into this position, if I was a shortstop, yes, I want to be this opening day shortstop, but the ability to show this coaching staff, hey, I can play third, I can play second. I may be even to play a little bit of outfield if needed. That's just, it goes to, goes more tools in your toolbox, the more able you are to be versatile.
And at 6'5", 360, can you put that in context as far as like a player that maybe played at UM in the past or that we might be familiar with, that time, basically correlates with what their time is?
He's a burner. I mean, he has the ability to steal bags. I think you look at a 6'5", you start talking about the range of, hey, this guy's one of those guys that can go steal a base for us at any time, right? And the 60-yard dash, it's likened it to, the football running the 40, right? You hear the 6'4", 6'5", that kind of perks your ears up, like when you hear a 4.3, 4.4 speed. Not necessarily one-to-one, but that is the type of speed that you have on the field, that he's going to be one of the faster guys in our lineup. So you're going to look at a guy like Adrian Areizaga to say, that might be a guy who gets on first base. He can instantly steal second. Now, the hardest part of the game is getting on first, right? You can't steal first base. So that hit tool is something that he's going to work on. And look, you expect these young guys when they come into ACC play. We saw it last year with Antonio Jimenez. All the tools in the world, but the great equalizer is that in-conference pitching, right? The scouting reports, teams that are going to find your weaknesses, they're going to exploit your weaknesses. How do you adjust? How quickly do you adjust? And are there other elements of your game? You're not just want to be a home run guy. Can you bunt your way onto first base? Can you hit the ball the other way? Can you get on base and then let your tools take over? A guy like Areizaga with that 6'5" speed, let's get him over to first base and let him be a demon on the base pass.
Yeah, it's interesting, just reading about this guy and seeing some of the highlights. Power over hit, the size, the speed, which you just talked about. Seems like he might have some of the better tools just on the roster. It seems like the roster's gotten better at baseball, maybe less toolsy overall, just more baseball players. Of course, you have Cuvée, who's a monster. But it seems like between Areizaga and then the guy we're going to talk about now, Brian Walters, you're talking about some of the better tools in the program right now. getting to Walters from a pitching standpoint, what does he bring to the table that maybe the rest of the room doesn't have?
Yeah, I think Brian Walters' career obviously started off so well at Miami. He burst onto the scene as a freshman, suffered an unfortunate Tommy John injury, which he spent a full year rehabbing. Comes back last year, and he had incredible flashes. Right, we saw the stuff, the fastball, obviously, mid to upper 90s at times. Really good breaking ball. The breaking ball is a strikeout pitch. That's his put away pitch. It's a really hard slider, 86, 87 miles an hour with a lot of depth. So you're looking at a guy. This is almost like a free agent you just acquired, right? Because you were at that tipping point. We don't know if we're getting Brian Walters back. All of a sudden, huge sigh of relief. Brian Walters comes back. Now, where they use him is anybody's guess. If, I'm anticipating Brian Walters being that, centerpiece in the back end of the bullpen. We saw him pitch the 8th inning this year, albeit in a much more reduced role. Not a lot of back-to-backs for Brian. Not a lot of extended outings because he was coming back from that serious elbow injury. I do anticipate, he's a full go next year. He's going to be one of those guys that, the training wheels come off. Brian Walters, if you are our 9th inning guy, he's going to be, in the long list of Miami closers that have had the dominant stuff, the put away stuff, much like his brother did 2 years ago for the Canes.
Yeah, just digging into the numbers. It's funny, when you're watching the season, there's so much stop and start with Brian Walters. Of course, the limitations he had going in, but also he was in a sling at one point. You're worried about that. Of course, he pitched at the combine, so we know he's healthy. 6'3", 194. I guess because of the stops and starts, I didn't realize how good his numbers were in those 13 innings. Just about 22 strikeouts, 2 base on balls, 14.5 K through 9, 1.3 walks per 9. So with what you saw last year and what Miami's added in terms of pitching depth, would you be comfortable putting a Nick Robert in that starting role and then just saying, Brian Walters, you're a closer?
Well, I think that was the whole impetus for building that bullpen, right, and that pitching depth, because we did see the flashes of Brian Walters. It just wasn't enough, right? We didn't have him at 13 innings for a guy as dominant as he is definitely not enough innings. And again, the limitations were there. Was all baked into the whole process of the season. We knew we weren't going to get a full healthy season of Brian Walters just because he was coming back from that serious injury. Now, all of a sudden, you get the ability for Brian to come in healthy, get a full fall camp under his belt, come into spring, presumably fully healthy. Training wheels come off, let him go. He's the kind of guy that with that kind of stuff, we saw it in such a small amount, and it's kind of like a tease, right? Like, I wish we had more. I wish we had the ability to see him over a full season. We've seen what his brother can do. We know it's in there. We know the kind of stuff he has. I definitely think with a guy like Walters coming back, you short up the bullpen through the transfer portal, sprinkle in a couple freshmen, move Nick Robert to the rotation where I think he slots in better. I think the profile is more of a starter, good sinking fastball, not necessarily the overpowering fastball that Brian Walters has at the back end, but Robert definitely has his stuff to get hitters, 2 times, 3 times through the order. This is the way it's set up. It's just worked out so nicely for Coach Areizaga, Coach Gutierrez. You get Walters back, plug him in the back of the rotation, figure out the middle innings that were so difficult for us with the bevy of transfer portal guys we have, and then, start working on the starting rotation the moment you get to fall camp.
Now, I got to ask this on Walters. I read an interview with JD where he said there was a chance that Walters could be a starter. Obviously, his brother was a closer the whole way through. You also think of a guy like Carson Palmquist, who really made his bones as a reliever his first couple of years at Miami, then becomes a starter, has a really good year as a starter, and now knocking on the doorstep of the pros as a starting pitcher. So we talked about Robert become a starter. Can you see a world where Walters is a starter? And if so, beyond just the durability, what else would he to show in his repertoire?
Yeah, and there's definitely a world, D. There's definitely a world that exists that Walters could become a starter. I just think from a workload standpoint, he's coming off a year. He had Tommy John surgery, pitches 13 innings last year. There need to be a significant workload increase for him to be a starter. We're talking about, quadruple the amount of innings at the very minimum in terms of what he'd be, producing as a starter. So I think in terms of the ramp up, it'd certainly be a longer runway for Brian to get to the point where he's going to be, a weekend starter at the ACC level. That's not to say he can't do it. I fully believe that if that's the plan for him, they're going to get him ready for it. I just think there's a more natural fit for him at the back end of a bullpen. I think the stuff plays up there. I think when you have a high velocity guy with a put away pitch, you talk about 14 strikeouts per 9. That's like Craig Kimbrell in his prime kind of stuff, right? Like you're not seeing those numbers from not every single guy can do that. Nobody. I wish mine was like 14 strikeouts. In the season would be enough for me. Like this guy's doing that over a small sample size, so the stuff really plays up. The stuff is there. Like mid 90s with a wipeout slider, man. Like how many closers do you see with that repertoire right now at the major league level? I mean, if I'm Brian Walters, I look at my brother's path and I'm thinking, my brother's in AAA, knocking on the doorstep, about to be, setup man for the Guardians here at a moment's notice. Like that could be me in 18 months. So I think if Brian Walters continues as a back end guy, there's certainly a pathway for him, to pitch the next level, sooner rather than later.
Yes, as you're saying that, I pulled up his brother's K through 9 and walks for 9. Very almost identical in Walters, Andrew Walters last year. Man, looking at Walters' sophomore year, 17.1 K through 9 and 1.7 balls based on balls per 9. But was there a third pitch there? You watch a lot closer than I do as far as being behind the plate. Did he tinker with anything there? Is that something he would need to do on top of the durability?
Yeah, I think, obviously as a starting pitcher, I mentioned the second and third time through the order. I wouldn't say the low reliever, you're really focused on, hey, these are my maybe 5 or 6 outs I need to go get if you're pitching the 8th and 9th. As a starter, you got to think about, hey, I got to go get, 17, 18 outs. Some cases you're pushing 20 outs, right? And you're not going to get that usually with a 2-pitch mix. You got to try and develop some sort of changeup, some off-speed pitch. We're seeing it at the big league level, right? Like these high velocity guys are throwing changeups at 94, 95 miles an hour. So there is the ability to develop an off-speed changeup style pitch rather quickly. But again, we're seeing guys with a 3-pitch mix. That's usually the formula for a starting pitcher, just because the rhythm of the game, to get 20 outs, you got to show these guys something. These are really good hitters at the ACC level. This is not high school ball. This is not low level, G5 baseball. This is big time Power 5 baseball, where getting guys out the second and third time you're not going to follow the same patterns you did the first time. So as a starting pitcher, you have to, think about the game a little bit differently. If I'm Brian Walters and I had that fastball and I had that slider, I'm walking into JD's office and I'm saying, I want the 9th, and I'm going to pitch the 9th, and I'm going to dominate in the 9th inning.
Well, listen, Miami had a list of problems they needed to solve, and it got a lot easier with these two. I want to say additions, returns, whatever you call it. These 2 players being in the building, I think definitely increases Miami's ability at 2 very important positions. Hav, glad to talk to you with some good news. If you're not following the Bullpen Mafia, you need to do that on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Music, anywhere you can find your podcast. Bullpen Mafia, Javi and Toad do an awesome job with the great merch as well. Dontre Willis, check out that interview coming up soon. And Javi, as always, go Canes.
Go Canes, D. Thanks.